Hey everybody, I'm doing this video today on soldering the wires and how I did my wiring in the RV for the lighting. I did a video on the walkthrough of the lighting that I did and the add-ons and stuff, and so I told you that I would do a video on this to show you how I soldered the wires together. Before I start this, I want to show you how the different connectors that you could possibly use other than soldering if you wanted to. I told you I didn't use them because I don't really like crimp-on connectors. So this is the first one that I had talked about. It's basically like a lock type connector. The way it works is you would take your wire that's running, you would clip it into there, then you would take your other wire and you would insert that into here, and then you would take your pliers and crimp down on this contact right there, that electrode. It's basically just a piece of metal with two slots in it, and what it would do when you push into it is it pushes into the insulation and into the wire, and thus what it's doing is connecting both wires together. The only problem with this is over time these connectors can become loose because any vibrations, and they just don't make good contact anymore. Also, the other problem is that sometimes they don't go all the way through the insulation. Even when you push this guy all the way through, sometimes it doesn't go all the way through. Like you know, this thing right here, there is really thick insulation on it, so it may not make it all the way through there. So you might have an issue with this actually making contact. The second one that I have is going to be just a regular butt connector. It's just a regular crimp-on straight connector. Now this is a bigger one, so what you could actually do is you could strip your wires and take two of them, and you could put both of them into the connector just like that. You see that? Then it crimp them down and it leaves you with an open connector here. Then you can bring your other lead in this way and crimp it down, and it would work just like that. Or you could take one of these type connectors, if you can see that. And they make these in a lot of different sizes, and really all these connectors you can buy them in a lot of different gauges and sizes. What this is, it's like a nylon type connector with a crimp connector on the inside, and it's just a cap, and all you do is you put all your wires all together in there just like that, and then you crimp it down. The only problem with this, the design flaw I see with these type of connectors, is that what could possibly happen if you don't make the crimp tight is that over time, with the wires doing this inside wherever you're at, or just small vibrations, the wires could possibly work their way out and pull out. Then you get a short. So like I said, that's why I'm not a fan of crimp connectors. That's why I solder everything. Okay, now what we're going to show now is I'm going to show you how to solder these wires in together. So I've already cut my wiring here, and the wiring that I've cut is we can pretend like this was originally just one single wire, but I've cut it already. Now what we're going to have to do is, let's say this is the wire we want to run to our other lights that we're wiring into our lighting system. So this is the new wire, this is the existing wire. So now that we've cut the existing wire in two pieces, we have to strip these wires and connect them to this one in order to feed the power. So what we'll do is we'll take, this is just a regular pair of wire strippers. You can buy them anywhere. There's a lot of different types of wire strippers. You can get them any way, shape, or form. I particularly like these. They work just fine. So you're going to just strip your wire down, and make sure you strip back enough that you're going to be able to fan the wires out. Whenever you go to solder your connections together, you want to fan your wires out just like that. because what this is going to do when you solder your wires together is you're going to be able to push them in together like this and then twist them. That's what you want. You don't want to just try and take solid wires and try and twist them together, because you're not going to get a good contact. This particular deal here, I bought it at a cheap tool store that everybody knows the name of. It works great. It does its job. It has a weighted bottom. Its job is just to hold the wiring or a circuit board or whatever you're using. It comes with a magnifying glass. I've never really even used that because I don't do anything on like small circuit boards and stuff that I would need that. But it could come in handy for things. So basically what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put those wires in there just like that. And then we're going to strip this wire down. And like I said, the big thing about this, cut that off and give us a new piece there. The big thing about this is it's stripping back enough wiring to be able to do this. You want to be able to fan the ends of the wire out. And you'll see here in a minute why I say that. When you go to put these together, you want to push them in just like this. You want them to go into each other as far as you can. Then twist them together just like that. And the tighter you can get the connection, the better off you are. I mean, remember, we're going to solder these together, so you know, it's not like they're not going to have a connection. As you can see, we have a really good connection right there. Alright, now the next thing we're going to move on to is I'm going to show you my soldering irons and my shrink tubing that I'm going to be using. This right here, we're not going to be using this today, but I brought this in here because I wanted to show you there's several different types of soldering irons you can use. You don't need any particular expensive soldering iron to do this. This is just a regular soldering iron, and funny enough, it's from Radio Shack. We don't even have any Radio Shacks around here. I bought this years ago. This thing's had a long life. I've used it a ton. It still works just fine as it did the day I bought it. And it's a corded one. It just plugs into your wall. And, you know, it works just as good as this one, honestly. This one is actually the one I use all the time. It uses butane fuel, and it just refills through the bottom. And this is made by Weller. I actually bought it from an electronics store. I work on electronics for a living. That's what I do. And I bought it from a store that I go in quite a bit. And this is a really great soldering iron. And it's just gas ran. And the big thing about this is there's no cord. You don't have to worry about electricity, so you can solder anywhere. And you don't have to worry about looking for an electrical outlet in order to use it. So that's why I like it. Another thing that I know is probably a faux pas is that a lot of times with wiring like this, I'll just solder with an open flame. And I do with this one. I have a tip that I can put on here, but the reason I use open flame on stuff like this is like when I'm in a ceiling, it's really hard for me to try and hold the tip to this and then get my solder in there and get the heat on it. It's really difficult. So what I usually end up using is an open flame, and I turn the flame down low because this thing is, you know, we're not looking at a blowtorch here. It's specifically designed for soldering. So it's almost like kind of like hot air soldering whenever you use the flame. And I've got two different solders here. One is a larger diameter solder. These are lead-free silver bearing solder, and it's rosin core. That's really important if you're going to start doing soldering. Is the older solder you could get, and you can still buy it, you can buy regular solder, and then you can buy the rosin containers where you can put your rosin on your wires separately. It's nonsense. Just buy the rosin core solder. You don't need the separate solder or anything. Just do this. The only thing that you get from putting that on there is that you can direct exactly where you want the solder to go into, whereas this is kind of more of a direct where you heat it up and you just push it into the joint. the only thing that I could see that you would benefit from using a separate rosin is if you were working on a board and you could put the drop of the rosin onto the actual spot you were soldering. That might be more beneficial. But for something like this where you're just soldering wires together, we're going to use a smaller diameter solder. And this is, like I said, a silver core solder. This is a high... basically it's for doing stuff like circuit boards and stuff like that. It's a high-end solder that this stuff is here. But we're going to use it for this. It'll give us a really good contact and it'll give us a really good solder joint. I use the smaller stuff for stuff like this just because I don't want excess solder. So what you're going to do, since this is a propane or a butane type light, you're going to light it and you're going to start heating the joint up. Now, when you're using an open flame, you got to keep in mind you don't want to melt your insulation. You just want to get it hot enough, and you're going to see smoke. It's no big deal. That's just your joint heating up, and we're going to test it. We're just going to start touching it. Okay, now we're starting to get hot enough. You just basically push your solder into the joint, and as you can see, it's starting to take the solder. Now that rosin is what allows it to push into the joint. Just like that. If you see that. Now I'm using a smaller diameter solder. I could use a bigger one and we could probably push more at a time through that joint. And do it faster. And I'll just show you what I mean. If we used a bigger diameter, here's a bigger diameter solder. Now let's heat this joint up. It's just harder to heat this solder as fast. You'll see what I mean. When you go to melt this bigger stuff, you got to get it a lot hotter to get the joint right. And we got the joint full of solder. When you solder your wires together, what you're trying to do is fill the wires. You don't really want to see a whole lot of copper left. You want to fill your wires with solder. That whole joint, you want it to be covered and basically encapsulated in solder. So your wires are all completely together. If you leave gaps and holes in your solder joints, it's just a good chance that it may break apart later on. But when you fill it like this, you're going to have a good solder joint. It's not going to come apart or break apart. Once this cools down, you want to take it out, and we'll move that aside for now. And you've got a good joint. If you see that, that's never coming apart. Now, keep in mind, and I will tell you this because even as many times as I've soldered stuff, I've made this mistake 100 times over, and I'm sure tons of people have. Before you start soldering, and I cannot say this enough, make sure and put your shrink tubing on first. Because just for, demonstration purposes, the ends of the wires are cut, so we can just slip it over. But when you're soldering, you have to keep that in the back of your mind that, hey, once I solder this, I can't put this on anymore. You're done. The deal's done. Once you solder it, you can't undo it unless you cut this joint out. So you want to keep in mind to make sure and slip your shrink tubing on first. Push it back on the wire far enough that it doesn't get the heat from your soldering at the time, because if it does, it's going to shrink down. You're not going to be able to get it over your fitting. But I'll show you how this works here. Now that the fitting has started to cool down, basically we can take this, slip it over the joint, and we got it on the joint now. Now, if you already had this on there, you just slip it down your wire where you had left it. You can use this, or you can even use a heat gun, but we're just going to shrink that down. If you see, you don't need to hold it in one spot for an extended period of time. You just need to kind of evenly put your heat across it, because you don't want to melt through it. You just want to shrink it down. Okay, and I mean, that's all there is to it. And if you see now, you have a nice water resistant connection. It's going to keep moisture out of your connection. You have a solid joint. That's, I mean, look at this, guys. You can hear me pulling against that. I would never trust this over this any day of the week, just because this joint always has the tendency to pull out for any reason. At any point in time, this joint, if you would have a crimp-on joint, it could pull out. And so that's the reason I solder everything. That is not going to come out. That's going to last the life of the RV, I guarantee you. Or anything that you're working on, this joint's going to last the life of whatever you have that you're working on, guaranteed. You know, you're going to end up breaking a wire before you're ever going to break that solder joint. But that is how I wanted to show you guys how I do it, and that's how I do it. Like I said, there's a couple of different other ways you could do it. I talked about this in another video. You could actually strip wiring off here and leave the wire solid and not cut it, and then you could take your wire and wrap it around here and then solder it in there. You could do that just like that, but the reason I said I didn't like that is it left an odd connection, so I don't do that. If you did do that, the only way to really cover your wiring afterwards is to buy some of the self-adhesive electrical tape. It basically is self-sealing. You can wrap it around itself, and it works sort of like the shrink tubing, except it uses a chemical reaction to seal itself around the wire. I've never used it, so I can't even tell you if it's that great. But I hear that it works the way it's supposed to. Then they also have a liquid electrical tape, which I do have and I have used. It works fine, it seems to me. You could use that over it. It's just really preference. It's what you feel good with putting inside of your RV or whatever you're working on. It's all about self-preference. You know, everybody has their own preferences on what they like, and this is just what I feel safe with being inside the RV. But that's all there is, guys. If you could press the like button if you like my videos, you can follow some of my other videos. Hit the subscribe button and hit the bell. I'm trying to get to 1,000 subscribers. You guys can watch some of my other videos on my channel. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you later.